When people think of lipids, they automatically go to, if I eat too much of them, I'll get fat. Well, this is partly true. If you eat too much lipids or too much fats, you will get overweight. This is the fact. But lipids play so much more of a role in our body than just make you fat. So, what is this? What is the purpose of lipids? So, to understand this, picture Ronaldo, okay? He's a human being just like you and me. And he is made up of billions of cells, right? Cells are the smallest unit of life, the smallest living thing. Now, to go one step further, what are cells made of? So cells are made up of these four macromolecules, these four structures: lipids, protein, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Okay, in this video, we're only going to talk about the lipids. What do lipids do? What parts of a cell do lipids make up? And what role does lipids play in our body besides structure? Okay, so let's get into it. So first of all, why? So why do we eat lipids? Well, to understand why we eat lipids, we need to understand their purpose in our cells, their purpose in our body. So what is their purpose? So Gru asks us, why? Let's answer. So one interesting thing is actually related to animals. Animals specifically, for example, polar bears. So we know polar bears, they can get pretty beefy, pretty fat, right? And there's a reason for this. Well, one is obvious. One is to keep them warm, and that applies to us as well, okay? And that's this reason here. Insulation. It helps keep us warm. It's like a jacket, okay? Because fat keeps heat inside our body. It's hard for heat to pass through fat outside of our body, out of our body, so we keep warm. Now, what about density? But obviously for people, we don't need that much fat anymore because we have clothes and jackets and all these things. But for animals, that's especially important. Now, what about density? So density is basically when you put oil or fats in water, what's going to happen to the fats? It's going to float, right? So this is called density. The fat is less dense than water, and so it floats on water. So when polar bears get really fat, this is useful because it makes them be able to float easier, meaning they can swim more easily because they have to put in less effort to float. Okay, so more fat means you float more easily because you have more fat, and fat is less dense than water, so meaning it floats easier. So that's a useful thing for animals though. Like for humans, it doesn't really matter that much, but for animals, that's pretty useful. What else? So one key one is energy. We know when we eat a lot of fats and also carbohydrates, right? We talked about carbohydrates before, and both of these are very important in energy for living things. We eat them because they give us energy, ATP. Now, when we compare carbohydrates and lipids, which one gives us more energy? If we had to take 1 gram of carbohydrate and 1 gram of lipids, which one will give us more energy, more ATP? Which one will give more ATP to our cells? The answer is lipids. When we have lipids per gram equal to carbohydrates, it will give us way more energy than carbohydrates. So that's why oftentimes it's difficult to lose fat, right? Because you have to burn so much of it. It takes so much energy to burn all of these, right? Because 1 gram already gives us a lot of energy. So you really need to spend a lot of energy before you can burn all of your fat, okay? So that's a key thing. Lipids are a key source of energy. They provide a lot of energy with little mass. Okay, there's one more. This is a trickier one, but it will make more sense throughout the video. Solubility. So this kind of relates to density. So we know that fats are hydrophobic, and this means they are scared of water. They don't dissolve in water well, which is why when we put fats in water, it separates from the water. It goes on, it makes a layer on top. This is useful. This is useful because if we look at a cell, we know its membrane is made up of phospholipids, right? This is a type of lipid, phospholipid. And we know because it's hydrophobic, it doesn't want to mix with the cytoplasm of the cell, because we know the cytoplasm is water. And so because it's a lipid, it doesn't dissolve well with the water. And this is useful because now we can separate all the stuff inside of the cell from the outside world. If the lipids were soluble, then we wouldn't be able to form this nice membrane. Okay, so that's one cool reason, another important reason why lipids are important. So in reality, you were probably only thinking of this one, or maybe if you're smarter, you actually knew the rest. But certainly for me, I only thought about the first one initially. I thought, yeah, it's only energy. Fats, don't eat so much because you're going to get fat. But there's so many other good reasons. So now what exactly does a lipid look like? Because we know lipids can be found in like oils and butter and all these fatty things. But what exactly is the structure? If we zoomed into a lipid, what would it look like? So here we go. Here we have a cell. So this is a cell, a random cell in our body. Here's the nucleus. Here's some mitochondria. Okay, and here we have a lipid. Okay, a lipid. We call this a fatty acid. Okay, a fatty acid. This is the simplest way of a lipid can be shown. Okay, so let me show you something, some key things. So notice at the end of this lipid we have this: a carbon, a hydrogen, and a hydrogen, and bound to another carbon. Okay, so this is, I'll show you just now what the name is. It's a methyl group. We call this a methyl group. You don't need to worry about this much. And now we also have this group here called a carboxyl group. Okay, I'll show you here. You need to know, by the way, you need to know how to draw this. And an easy way to remember is that carbon always needs to bind to 4 things. So you can see, you'll learn this in chemistry, but in biology, you just need to remember. So carbon always binds 4 things. So we can see here, carbon is bound to 1, 2, 3, 4 things. How about this carbon? 1, 2, 3, 4 things, right? And even here, here's a carbon. It has 4 bonds. Even though it's only bound to 3 things, it has 4 bonds. So it's bound to 1, but it's 2 bonds here to oxygen, so that's 3 total. And then to this oxygen, so that's 4. So an easy way to remember if you're drawing it right is to double check if your carbons all make 4 bonds, okay? And oxygen always makes 2 bonds. So you can see here, this oxygen is making 1, 2 bonds, okay? So it's fine. And this oxygen is making 2 bonds, 1 to this carbon and 1 to this hydrogen. So if you remember, and hydrogens always only make 1 bond, okay? So if these things are correct, most likely you've drawn the structure correctly. Now, let me show you here. So we call this a methyl group. You don't need to worry too much about this, okay? Doesn't matter. And then we have all of these repeating units: CH2, C2Hs, C2Hs, C2Hs. And this can vary. So what I have right here is a fatty acid that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 carbons long. It can vary. You can have a 50 carbon long fatty acid or a 10 carbon long fatty acid, okay? It varies, okay? There's not one set amount of carbons that you need. If you draw something like this, you'll be fine. If they ask you to draw a fatty acid, there's no right number, okay? It just can't be too short. So it can't be like 3, okay? That doesn't really count as a fatty acid. What makes a fatty acid is if it has a long hydrocarbon chain, and this means hydrogen and carbon. So hydrogen carbon chain, okay? If it has a long chain, it's a fatty acid, okay? Now, what's next? What do we need to know? We need to know some other small features. So when we look at this fatty acid, what do we notice? Okay, we notice that there is no, let me show you this. We call this one saturated, okay? Saturated fatty acids, because these carbons are fully saturated with hydrogens, okay? They are unable to bind any more hydrogens, okay? And you'll see what I mean by this. Because if we look at this fatty acid, you can see this carbon still has 4 bonds, 2 to carbon, 1 hydrogen, and another one to carbon. This one is unsaturated. Let me show you. We consider this one, gotta find it, sorry. This one is unsaturated, okay? And what I mean by this, because we know the word saturated means to be full of, right? So this one is considered unsaturated because it is not full of hydrogens, okay? Because technically this bond here is being shared now between carbons, whereas here it was bound to hydrogen. So this one is full of hydrogens. It cannot have any more. But we know carbon can only make 4 bonds. So as soon as it decides to bind twice to carbon, it can't bind another hydrogen because its maximum amount is 4 bonds. So we consider this an unsaturated fatty acid because it isn't completely full of hydrogens like this one is, okay? So these are 2 types of fatty acids. So if you zoom into fats, you'll see these two types. Saturated fatty acid, meaning they're full of hydrogens, or unsaturated, meaning there's missing some hydrogens because the carbons are binding to each other instead. So you can see in this one there's two hydrogens here, whereas here they're missing because instead these carbons decided to bind to each other twice instead of once. So they're unsaturated. Now, depending on how they bind to each other twice, we can see in this example here, the hydrogens that are remaining are facing the same direction. So we call this a cis unsaturated fatty acid. Okay, if this fatty acid chain has a double bond here with the hydrogens facing the same direction. Cis, it sounds like the same. Cis, same. Cis, same. Okay, they face the same direction. And then we have another example here. Instead, the hydrogens aren't facing the same direction. One is facing up this way, one is facing down this way. This is called trans. Okay, trans. So you can have overall, there are many different types of fatty acids. It can be a saturated fatty acid. It can be an unsaturated fatty acid. If it's unsaturated, it can be a cis unsaturated fatty acid or a trans unsaturated fatty acid. Now, you can also have a mono unsaturated fatty acid, which is basically this fatty acid when it only has one double bond somewhere. Okay, that would be called mono because mono means single. But it can be called polyunsaturated, like this one. It has more than one double bond. Okay, so it has more than one location where two carbons are binding to each other twice. Okay, so this is essentially what it would look like if you looked at fats closely. Okay, now, like I said, these are very useful. So your cell can use these to break it down through cell respiration to make a lot of energy, right? Just like this. Okay, so that's one purpose. Now, we mentioned the other functions here, okay? But let's keep moving a bit forward, okay? So it doesn't stop here. This is not their only purpose. They don't only stay alone like this. They can also bind together with other molecules to make other kinds of lipids, okay? Because this is the most simple form of a lipid. But when it interacts with other molecules, which I'll show you now, it can form other more complicated lipid structures. Let me show you. So here we have, okay, the same cell, just a random cell, and we have these lipids. So here's the lipid, right? We can see it has the carboxyl group and the methyl group, and I illustrated in this one. So we have three fatty acids, one here, one here, one here. All three of these just happen to be saturated, okay? There's no double bonds, okay? So they're saturated. Any of these could have been unsaturated. For the purpose of this video or this section here, I'm just making them saturated for simplicity's sake, okay? So we have three of these fatty acids here, and then we have one molecule here called a glycerol. Okay? So you can see it. This glycerol molecule has three carbons, and it has these OH groups. Okay? So this is a glycerol, okay? Now, like I said, these fatty acids don't always stay alone. They can interact with other molecules, and this is one example. These fatty acids can combine with this glycerol. Okay, let me show you how. Notice this group here. You can see the OH from this fatty acid and the hydrogen from this glycerol, they like each other, and they want to bind to each other instead, because guess what? This would form water, because H2O, that's water. So they would love to interact with each other. So they basically, what happens is this OH will come off of this fatty acid, and this H will come off of this glycerol. And once they come off, they bind together to form water. This is called a condensation reaction. And now, guess what? Now this carbon only has three bonds. 2 to oxygen, 1 to carbon, because now this group left. So it's missing a bond, and we know it loves to make 4 bonds. Same on this side. This oxygen, I said before, loves to make 2 bonds. And in this case, it has 1 to carbon, 1 to hydrogen. But if this hydrogen leaves, now it only made 1 bond. So both oxygen and carbon here are missing a bond. So they decide to instead just bind together, because then they're both happy. So let me show you clearly. So here we go. So this hydrogen pops off, this OH group pops off, They interact, they bond together, now they form water. And now we have both of these missing a bond, man. They're missing a bond. And so now instead they just decide to come together. So let me move this out of the way. So here they go together. Okay? This is difficult to put together. Wait a sec. Okay, cool. So now they are together. And now this structure is called a triglyceride. Let me show you the word. Triglyceride. Tri, because three. Tri means three. So they have three fatty acids together with the glycerol. So we call it triglyceride. Three fatty acids with one glycerol. Triglycerol, sometimes abbreviated as TG. Okay? So that's cool. That's it. So that's one more thing you need to know. You need to know how to draw this structure. It's called a triglyceride. Okay? And you need to know it happens by a condensation reaction when water leaves. So far you know some functions, okay, of lipids. These four important ones. You know the structure of the simplest lipid called the fatty acid. You know it can be saturated, unsaturated, cis, trans, and all this kind of stuff. And you also know that these fatty acids don't always stay alone. They can interact with a glycerol to form a triglyceride. Okay? One last thing you need to know is related to this. Notice this. This right here is a glycerol, just like this right here. Okay? But this glycerol only has two fatty acid chains. Okay? And by the way, notice this one is unsaturated because it's got double bonds, these fatty acids. Okay? Now, it doesn't matter this because different triglycerides will have different fatty acids on it, so it will always vary. Okay? It depends on what the molecule is. But notice the third fatty acid is not there. Instead of the third fatty acid, we have a phosphate. The oxygen that was here, instead of interacting with the third fatty acid, this oxygen is now interacting with a phosphate. So we call this molecule a phospholipid. And we all know, maybe you don't know yet, but a phospholipid is a tiny, tiny, tiny molecule, a tiny, tiny lipid that goes into the membrane. It makes up the membrane of the cell. So you can see these, right? These mini phospholipids. So that is how a phospholipid is formed. It's that simple. That shows another very important function of lipids, okay, in general. They have many important functions. So I hope this is making sense so far because we're going to get into one last bit here related to, it's not going to be complicated anymore, but this is one important part you need to know. Lipids and health. If we eat healthy, we can be like Ronaldo. If we eat very unhealthy, a lot of unhealthy foods, we can have disease. We can become obese, okay? We can have many, many problems. So I introduced to you all of these types of fatty acids, right? Saturated, unsaturated, cis, and trans. Depending which one you eat the most of in your diet can affect your health. One of these is very good. Two of them are very bad. Okay, and you can guess right now which ones you think, but I'll show you why they're bad. So the reason why some of them can be bad is because they can lead to coronary heart disease. So let me show you. Here we have Eddie Hall, okay, and we're going to look right inside at his heart. So here we have him, he's happy. There's his lungs and his heart, okay? And we notice these little vessels, okay, coming onto the heart. These are called coronary arteries or coronary vessels. And these vessels is basically the vessel that supplies the heart itself, because we know the heart sends blood to all over the body, but it's important that the blood also is able to send blood to itself, so itself can get so that itself can also get blood and nutrients to survive. But sometimes these coronary arteries can have a disease, meaning they can get blocked or hardened or have problems, and this means that if they're blocked, then the blood can't travel through them to the heart, and so the heart will die. Okay, and this is called a heart attack. Okay, so it's called a coronary heart disease. When your heart can't supply itself with blood due to a clog, it's called coronary heart disease, and this will lead to a heart attack. Okay, so which of these which of these fats, these fatty acids that I mentioned, are the bad ones and which are the good ones? Let me show you. So, We saw this one. This one is the saturated fatty acid. This one is the unsaturated, trans. This one is the unsaturated, cis. Okay? We can see that the saturated one leads to, doesn't lead to, but has a positive correlation with coronary heart disease. This means that in all the people who had a coronary heart disease, most of them had an elevated or an increased amount of saturated fatty acids in their blood or in their diet. Okay? On the contrary, people with trans, wait, I messed this one up. Similarly, people with high level of trans fatty acids in their blood was found to also have coronary heart disease. But people who had a lot of cis fats in their blood was associated with a lower risk of coronary heart disease. Okay, so you need to remember this. Now, let me tell you, which foods correspond to which of these fatty acids. So, saturated fatty acids can be found in many of the foods that you already know. Butter, okay? Butter especially, cheese, bacon, those kind of food, the bad foods that you know. The foods that you know is really not that healthy and you shouldn't really eat them, okay? Obviously a little bit is okay, but if you really go eat too much too regularly, it's bad and it can contribute to the development of this kind of disease and then causing heart problems, right? Now, how about trans? So trans is basically formed by companies. So for example, let's say McDonald's, okay? McDonald's, in reality, they have like they have this kind of this. Let's say the cheese at McDonald's has this kind of, or the food at McDonald's has this kind of fatty acid normally, but in order to make it preserve longer, they convert it into this kind of fat, this kind of fatty acids. So they convert it from a cis to a trans fatty acid, and a trans fatty acid can lead to coronary heart disease. So it's important that that you know that trans fatty acids are formed by companies, okay? It's when companies try and make their food last longer, and in doing so, they make them unhealthy, okay? So this one you kind of find in fast food restaurants and places that make preservatives, okay? Now, where do you find the healthy fat? That's the question we all want to know. Where do we find the cis fatty acids? We can find these in foods like oil. For example, sunflower oil, olive oil, avocado oil, even just in avocados. If you eat avocados, that's healthy. That's also has cis fatty acids in them. Nuts, even nuts, and what else is there? Yeah, these are the general. You can Google some more of them, but those are the key ones. Okay, so all of those are actually good for you, whereas these are generally bad for you. So, and due to the idea of coronary heart disease. So typically Western countries are associated with these saturated fats, and so they have a higher incidence of coronary heart disease, whereas some other countries like the Mediterranean and Japan and things like this, they don't have a high diet in these kinds of fats, so they have a lower incidence of coronary heart disease. So this is something that's very important to pay attention to, because heart disease is the leading cause of death before cancer. So it's the highest cause of death in the world. So it's something that's very, very important, I think. So I hope you learned something in this video, and that everything kind of makes mostly sense. This is really everything you need to know, so I'm not skipping out on any details. And good luck.